Being from Iowa, I thought I'll let you know, this is a Charles Eames rainmaking machine, and we desperately need it. Well, let me first note that we're honored to have funded this documentary that we've been watching. Secondly, we're pleased to co-host this event with the Grassroots Leadership Conference of the American Institute of Architecture Students Association. In the pantheon of design, Charles and Ray Eames have carved out a venerated niche. They innovated with a sense for America, but also a thorough knowledge and appreciation of modernist aesthetics advanced abroad. Their now famous Bauhaus-influenced home had a Mondrian-like exterior wall. Charles's much pictured, now lost sculptural contraption, not too dissimilar from the one we saw, reflected Calder-esque engineering whimsy with a Kafkaesque name, the solar do-nothing machine. His often articulated pursuit of the most for the least complements Mies van der Rohe's observation that less is more. In their joint undertakings, Charles clearly appreciated and borrowed from Ray's artistic sensibilities, but he considered their work design rather than art because their efforts revolved around solving problems. Fashion can be a fleeting moment in time, but as this new century has commenced, it appears that the minimalist balance and harmony, the designs that this yin-yang partnership created, have multi-generational appeal. So to probe the influence Charles and Ray Eames have had in their work, we've assembled a panel of a new generation of American architects. First, we'll hear from Michelle Kaufman. With her firm, Michelle Kaufman Studio, Michelle specializes in sustainable lifestyle designs, including single-family homes, eco-luxury resorts, and multifamily communities. She has a number of her homes showcased in museums, which not many architects do, Michelle. A full-size replica of Michelle's home was constructed at the National Building Museum as part of the exhibit The Greenhouse, and a fully functioning three-story home she designed is on display at the Museum of Science and History. Her work has also been on display at MoCA, the Walker Art Center, and the Vancouver Art Center. Michelle received her undergraduate degree from Iowa State University and her master's from Princeton, but most of all has been well educated because she graduated from a public high school in Davenport, Iowa, as I did. Allison Wilson holds 2 architecture degrees from the University of Maryland. She and Leah Davies, who I'll introduce next, won a design competition for a watershed home. Allison currently works at Ayers St. Gross in Baltimore, where she heads up many of the firm's sustainability initiatives. Leah Davis, also a University of Maryland graduate, now practices architecture at an international design firm in DC, Perkins and Will. Leah aspires to use architectural practice and teaching to create a stronger connection between the educational experience and our everyday lives. After Allison and Leah present their watershed project, Jason Cohen will take the stage. Jason, who worked with Bill Jersey to make the Eames documentary, has an impressive career both in filmmaking and journalism. He has produced and directed industrial films for numerous clients and written articles for Rolling Stone magazine, the Los Angeles Times, the San Francisco Chronicle, and other major periodicals. With a grant from the California Council for the Humanities, Jason is currently working on a film about Proposition 13. Jason earned a master's degree in journalism from the University of California at Berkeley. He'll reflect on the role of the Eames played in shaping the modern aesthetic and then moderate a discussion between Michelle, Allison, and Leah. To conclude, Jason will open the discussion to questions from the audience. After the program ends, all are invited to the American Institutes of Architecture for a not-so-modernist barbecue. Thank you. So if you all come up here, and we welcome you. Okay. Maybe one at a time come up here. This is Allison from Davenport, Iowa. Please.
Great. It's kind of tough to follow the Eames, but I'll do my best. So we love the Eames, but why we're here today is to talk about what we can learn by looking back at them. And I think that this number is a big part of that. This is the number of the year, 7 billion. 7 billion people on this planet. And as we look to projections of population increase, it's pretty scary. And we hear a lot about transportation being a big carbon emitter, big energy consumer. We hear a lot about industry, but it's buildings that actually use more energy than any other industry. And buildings that create more carbon than any other industry. And buildings are making us sick. So buildings are our biggest problem. But that's pretty exciting because it means that through innovation, buildings are actually our biggest solution. And that's really exciting. It's a great time to actually be an architect. And so as we look back, and I will look back on and share a bit of my story. So I started working at Frank Gehry's office out of school, which was really exciting. It was fabulous, seeing people being overwhelmed when they would walk into the Bilbao Museum, weeping, overcome from the beauty of great design. But when I was looking for a house for myself, it was not that situation at all. It was super depressing. My husband and I couldn't find anything that we liked that we could afford. We started going into therapy, thinking, what have we done so wrong in our lives that we can't find a place to live? And then, you know, as I think, let's design for the masses and not just for the elite. And by looking at the small a, not the big A architecture, and there is a place for the big A architecture, don't get me wrong, I love the museums and I love Frank Gehry, but if we look at the individual homes, this is where we can actually have a huge impact. Homes have so much waste in construction. It's crazy. We're so used to seeing these bins just overflowing with trash. And so when my husband and I, after the 6 months of therapy, we finally decided, well, maybe we can just build something for ourselves. And so my husband's a builder, and so he built our house, and we just made a small, thoughtful home, and we wanted it to produce all of its own energy and be healthy. And that's when I went through this process of realizing, okay, we as architects can either complain about the landscape being filled with these kind of thoughtless, crappy homes, or try to do something about it. And that's when I set on this mission to make thoughtful, sustainable design that's accessible, because it's no longer a question of if people want green homes or not. They do. They want lower energy bills. They want lower water bills. They want healthy environments for their families. But it can't take any more time than a non-green home. It can't cost any more than a non-green home. And it needs to be easy. So looking back again at Eames and thinking about alternative systems for construction, simplifying the process. I think this is probably a pretty savvy group, so you probably know all the differences between these different terms on this slide, but a lot of times people get confused and they compress all of these terms together, whereas prefabrication is sort of anything that is built off-site in some way and shipped to a site. So components, panelized systems, manufactured. Manufactured is what trailer homes are. They typically are not attached to a permanent foundation, which is why they fly through the air and tornadoes and hurricanes. But the work that I've been focused on is modular, which is still volumetric, built in a factory, but it's built to site-built code, so it's very different than manufactured. But part of the problem why we are so behind other countries in the US is because we have trailer homes and people don't understand that that's a very different thing. And so unfortunately it's been branded in a sort of negative way. And so it's a great time that we can unbrand or rebrand and really try to use technologies that we have at hand to make buildings that are so much better in so much less time. And they are stronger. It's really cool. Like once you actually see some of these buildings get built in a factory, you can see in this image that the modules are moving along this assembly line on these tracks so that the house actually goes to the electrician rather than the electrician going to the house. It's really cool. They're built much stronger and so much less waste because they have storage capacity. So as they're cutting materials down, they don't have to just chuck it away. They have some place to put it and reuse it again and again. And they're not building outside where it's really tough to ever actually get the moisture out of the framing. And plus, who wants to be working in that environment? Nobody I know. So in the past 6 or 7 years that I've been doing this, we've built over 55 homes. Homes that create their own energy, produce their own energy, that are built in a factory, shipped to a site. Homes like this one. So homes that you wouldn't consider being made in a factory, like so beautiful. This one came as a series of 11 modules that were put together, stacked together. It came with most of its siding on the systems already baked in. Like this kitchen actually came from the factory. It came wrapped, and they set it on the foundation. And I pulled off the plastic and walked in, and I just wanted to lick it. It was so great. Because everything you see in this image, other than the lamps hanging and the fruit, came from the factory. So, you know, the teak cabinetry, the concrete countertop, the glass wall with the glass cabinets in front, that all came from the factory. It was so great. So once you start doing this work, it's just impossible to go back. And this allows us to really bake in a lot of these sustainable systems. So a lot of times with builders, they want to build better, but it can take a lot of research, it can take a lot of time. They have to get new supply chain to figure out, like, you know, how am I going to order recycled paper countertops? So this allows us to kind of bake all of these systems in, starting with smart design, designing to use less by well-placed windows that sculpt in the natural light, making smaller spaces feel larger than they are by having open spaces, using smart systems that will help us reduce our energy, help simplify our lives. Efficient materiality, so bamboo, of course, is the poster child of green building, and great, it can be a beautiful poster child. We can use that, but we can also use systems like this kitchen actually came from cabinetry that was going to be thrown out. It was from a school that was being torn down, so we reclaimed that cabinetry, or things like this tile that was made from recycled wine bottles, which is great, so you can sit back and be drinking a glass of wine and feel like you're doing your part. Using materials that are going to last a long time, that don't require maintenance. So things like Corten steel, it's such a beautiful material. Coming up with new siding systems that will actually collect water to use inside the house. Water efficiency is a big one, as we're starting to hear that water is the next oil, water is the next scarce resource. So everything we can do, there's a lot we can do actually just by putting in low flow water heads, using smart water sense systems here, using green roof, which helps to reduce stormwater runoff, using gray water systems to collect sink water to use for the toilet. It's almost a crime that we actually put drinking water in our toilets. It's ridiculous, so there's lots we can do even in existing homes to help that. Using rainwater systems to collect the rainwater and use that for watering the landscapes. Energy conservation, this of course is a big one. Doing well-placed glass, having homes of course situated properly, having good heating and cooling systems, great insulation systems, smart lighting systems like this fixture, which I love, that I designed. And you know, again, smart systems that help us actually see how much energy we're using and how much water we're using in real time. That is one of the biggest things that can help us, because if we just get our electric bill a month later, it's hard to actually know what to do about it. But if we can be seeing it in real time, then we can use that information wisely. So the best thing we can do is actually make our homes super efficient, and then on top of that, look to alternative energy systems. Healthy spaces, choosing materials that are non-off-gassing, that you know, growing food in our homes can be great. And so with this then, as you start to do this kind of work, it's good to be a storyteller, to share it. And so that's been a big part of the work that I've been doing too, is to actually have homes that are exhibits. And so as was mentioned, there was a full-size replica of my house that was up in the National Building Museum here for a year, so people could walk through it. We had a house in front of City Hall in San Francisco, and that was really cool because that was something that everybody could go into. So it wasn't just somebody who's going to a museum, but it was like the guys at the bus stop, or you know, the people going to pay their parking ticket. And they would walk by and say, oh, what is this? Oh, this is a green home. Oh, that's cool. I could live here. I thought green homes were, you know, made out of recycled tires. And so having people experience these things is really powerful, because then they can start to feel empowered. And then being a storyteller and sharing things, like you know, as you have these great ideas, as you come up and find systems that you think are really good, don't just keep those to yourself, but share that, tell these stories. And we have so many venues, of course, now where we can do this, and where architects can start embracing things. And so while it may seem cheesy, like having a YouTube channel or doing these YouTube videos, it's actually really great, because you know, if people are watching these things. And so while there's these terrible TV stations like HGTV that are kind of filled with really bad content. This is a great venue for us, right? Please, please embrace these venues because they're hungry for good content. So let's give them good content. Let's not just have them tell the crappy stories. And let's make our information clear to people. So, you know, it's like homes should come with nutrition labels, something so easy for everyone to understand. So it's really looking back at how the Eames, they could tell stories that would resonate with everyone. It wasn't just information that would resonate to other architects, which is great and fun, and you know, we know how to do that. But let's remember that if we can actually tell stories to people like our grandmothers, that's where we can really start to have a big impact. And another part, another great lesson that I've learned from the Eames and also from my personal experience is this idea of failure. And to sort of say, okay, to not be afraid of failure, and to also not think of failure in that negative sense, but that it's a moment to pivot. It's a moment to sort of say, okay, let's reassess, and is there some other way to address this? And they iterated and you know, to see all of the work that they produced in their studio and to actually come up with the end result, they had so many iterations along the way. And the pivots like we saw in the movie. In my own personal tale, it was sort of learning about this chicken and the egg problem of mass production or prefabrication to really get to the benefits that it can offer, to really get to having lower costs, lower time. It requires quantity, it requires a lot of volume, it requires doing a number of homes to get those numbers down. But you can't really get to those numbers until you can get the cost and the time frames down, so it's this chicken and the egg problem. So to then back up and say, okay, how can we do that? Well, multifamily, urban infill, this is actually the place where it begins to unlock. So I've been working on this multifamily project in Denver. We did 8 homes at one time. It took the same amount of time to do 8 homes as it did to do 1 in the factory, and the cost came down by half if we were just doing 1 single family home. So this is where we can begin to unlock these lower price points. So what we're working on now for the next phase of this project is offering up single family urban infill options from the multifamily option. So that way if somebody just has a single family, they can actually add on to the queue from the multifamily, get the same price as the multifamily for the single family. So sort of unlocking that price point. And also to change this idea of what an architect is. We learn that there's a very specific role we have with these boundaries of what we do and what our consultants do and what the contractor does. And so something that's just always so wonderful to remember from the Eames is we have this great education, we have this great skill set. So let's use this time to apply it, and I hope a lot of you do. There's so many areas to really redesign, like mechanical systems, electrical systems. Like, it would be so great. It's fine that there's not the jobs at the big architecture firm that you think is so cool. Great. Like, take this time then and come up with the new mechanical system that can be beautiful, that we don't want to hide away, but we actually want to see it. So I think that this is a really great thing for us to remember. In my own case, I've been, spending time sort of, when I don't find products that I like, then sort of inventing them and creating them as products. And then share. This idea is really, it's so great to see this next generation, your generation, rethinking not that the old idea of how architects sort of see, like, this is my idea, so this is where my value is. I'm not going to share it. In my own situation, I had lots of people emailing me about this barn door track detail that we used a lot in these sliding wood sunshades. So I was like, great, I'll just make this detail online. I'll tell people how to do it, just share it with them, like, here's where you buy it, here's where I found the least expensive thing. And so just sharing these ideas, making it accessible. Because if we're really gonna move the dial, the more we can share good ideas, the more we can build on top of each other's great ideas. That's what we really need to have the momentum for the innovation. And also for us to be the kind of architects that we want to be. The more that we can share data, the more that we can capture and have a lot at our fingertips, this is going to be great for all of us. And so to really break down that our idea is somehow the copyrightable, like, this is my value, this is my intellectual property. Let's look to the other models, the newer models of thinking about intellectual property, what we share, how we share it. There's great things to learn. This book by Chris Anderson, who's the editor-in-chief of Wired magazine, of course, threw a lot of people into a tizzy because his premise is, I think rightly so, that things are going to be available for free. Information is available for free. So it's just the way the world is moving. So you're either going to have to figure out some way of dealing with this, or you're going to be left behind. Of course, writers are having to deal with this. And so one can think, well, how can I make money if I'm sharing information freely? Well, clearly, there are good models out there of companies who are all about sharing information freely, who seem to be doing just fine financially. This is some of the Google offices. But also, if we look at the music industry, right, they have gone through a whole overhaul and still are. So if we look to Lady Gaga as an example, she gives away most of her music for free. She's doing just fine financially. She makes most of her money out of her concerts. So is there something that we can learn from rethinking things for architects? And there are some models that I think are pretty interesting. Architecture for Humanity, open source. So Architecture for Humanity, rather than saying, okay, we're going to come up with a design for one school in Kenya and that's it. No, the idea is you come up with that really great school, it produces its own energy, it's really healthy, it's a great environment for kids to learn. You make it then available for free for anyone to build in any climate that sort of makes sense for that climate, that makes sense with those building materials. And the more that we can share this in areas like disaster relief, the better. But also there are models out there like Etsy, right? Like we have this platform where we can be designing things and we can go directly to the person who's going to be buying. So while it might not be, selling a sweater, there are models out there that we can look to. And so with SketchUp, for example, their 3D warehouse, or with house plans. So you can then actually post your own designs, and you can have people find your designs, and just buy them directly from you. So this is a great thing, especially for younger architects, where you don't have to have the big marketing budget in order to actually get clients to realize your work. It's more about good content that actually rises to the surface. So that's pretty exciting. And there's other websites like House, Houzz, where you can put your portfolio online. You can have these audiences that can find you with good content without the big marketing budget. And it's this time where we're seeing the big problems in the world, and we're working together, that we are the strongest at those moments. And like the Eames, redesigning our process. So in my personal life, going through the idea of analyzing the typical model that we all know, the client, the architect, builder, they're separate. Architect has their consultants, the builder has their subcontractors. But when we look at factory build, it sort of begins to muddle things. And then there's sometimes the dealer network. And so I went through the process then of sort of becoming the dealer. And then that didn't quite work. So then we bought our own factory and became the builder, which then, basically we were design build, which had a lot of simplification, which was great. And now we are starting to see integrated project delivery, which is really exciting, where it's actually more value-based, where everyone shares in the risk and shares in the reward, which is a really strong idea. So as we look to what the future architect will be, the future architect that you all will be, it's not just doing design build, but it's integrated delivery. You actually then get, because you're providing value, you will get money not just from your fees, but from the benefit that you're providing. That you will be the team leader. You're not just the artist, you're not just the design technician, but you're the team leader. You'll work with a virtual team, globally. And it'll be based on results. So this is pretty exciting. This model of an architect, this is a really strong model. And it's great because as we are in this perfect storm, this storm of the economic crisis, the environment crisis, we can actually then, through innovation, really provide a lot of great options. So let's remember to embrace our optimism. And so many times architects are so serious. And while we are serious, and we need to be serious about the work and take it seriously, we have to remember to play. Otherwise, this is who we will become. And this is not who we can be so much better. And this is not who we want to be. And so let's use technology. Let's remember from the Eames, and this is who we can be. And this is who the world needs us to be, because this is what is needed. So, let's remember to play also, because we need to remember to have sustainability in our own lives, sustainability of our own bodies. This whole idea of working all the time, that is not sustainable. Let's remember to play. And I look forward to seeing what you guys all come up with. So thank you.
Okay, so I'm Leah, and this is Allie, and we're a couple of the representatives from University of Maryland's Solar Decathlon team. And this is our project, Watershed. We're probably going to tie into a ton of the topics already discussed, but hopefully we can relate a little bit more to the audience, since you guys are mainly students. Allie and I both just finished school last year and entered the professional world. And we'd love to take you through not only the design of our house, but also sort of the process that we went through, never having designed or built a house before.
Or anything.
Yeah. So before we go into the design of the house, I'm curious, how many of you grew up or live currently in a house or home that looks or resembles something like this? Okay. So it has a front door, it has a garage. It often gives precedence to the car, the automobile, not the person, not the people that are living in it. It has sloped roofs that shed the rain and the water away from the house and off the site. And most interestingly to me, it usually has absolutely no relationship to its surrounding environment, its natural environment. It's just sitting on the land. So the Solar Decathlon, which is the competition we're going to be talking about, which is our entry, aims to challenge these preconceptions using solar power as the sort of foundation for sustainable design. So it asks 20 collegiate teams to, over a 2-year process, design, build, and operate a solar-powered, attractive, and affordable home. So as Michelle was saying, not something that, in previous years, people were coming to the competition with $1 million house. And people were saying, this is beautiful and this is awesome, but this doesn't work for the public. So that competition got added affordability. And then all of the homes are designed to be transported into one location where they're judged on 10 different categories that are up on the screen there. But more importantly, they're all brought to one place to be put on public display, because the most important part of the competition is really about public outreach and teaching people how we can use more sustainable technologies and innovations in our own homes. And as you can see, every house is different. Everybody takes the same problem and comes up with a solution in a completely different manner.
So that being said, what is it like to do one of these? What does your life become if you decide to let it? So we started the project in January of 2009, question mark? Sorry. And it started as this whole list of things of what does it mean? What are we creating? We don't know. It's a house. We know there's the competition. What's it going to look like? We don't know. How are we going to build it? We also don't know. Who is going to be a part of this team? And it becomes this great collaboration. That picture in the lower left is one of our early design meetings where it's a group of architecture students talking to a whole bunch of engineering students and environmental science guys going, all right, we think this could be a house. And then the mechanical engineering students are going to come to you and say, I don't think I can solve that problem, try again. And you go back and forth, and you have these really great conversations with those people. Sorry, the guy all the way on the right, he's a builder. He builds houses for a living, and he comes in and he looks at what you're drawing and he goes, really? You really going to make that happen? But you do, and you experiment with those ideas, and you brainstorm and you test them. One of those things that you also don't usually do in school, you kind of take your designs through as far as you can get in 6 weeks, basically. And with this, you do that 6-week part, but then you also have the implications that you're going to spend next summer building it. So you have to figure out how to actually go from those really beautiful drawings that, you pin up on the wall and you admire because they're gorgeous and they took you 3 days. And then you have to kind of make those more technical drawings that say how part A meets part B. Learning about specifications that I'm pretty sure I never ever would have learned about in school if it weren't doing this. And then the scheduling end of it, so the business part of the proposition of being an architect and what that schedule looks like and how you make that happen. Building it. So even though you've gone through all of that designing and you've crafted your drawings to try to help you describe how you're going to put this piece together, you get out on site and you discover, oh, well, that doesn't look the way I thought it would. And then you take it apart and you do it again. So that idea of building it and failing because it didn't match what you wanted or what your intentions were, and then rediscovering what you could do instead becomes a big part of it. So through all seasons. We started in the winter and we finished in August, and anybody who's been outside today, it's a pretty miserable summer out there. Also, the idea of modularity, that with these houses, travel is such a huge design constraint. when I started my job last May, I started working on buildings that weren't going to move. They were going to sit where they were forever. I was so excited, right? Because the hardest part of doing a solar house like this for the solar decathlon is that you have to take the whole thing apart, move it someplace else, reassemble it, and do the whole thing. It's absurd. It's awesome. This lower left-hand picture is probably, to date, the absolute scariest moment of my life. We had just gotten to the construction site on the National Mall, and our house was getting lifted by a crane into the air. And the competition
On
starts.
top of one of the other team's houses.
Yeah. And the competition starts in 6 days, and it's my birthday, and I'm standing there going, oh God, if they drop it now, there's absolutely nothing we can do to save it. And it was great, and it was terrifying. If you like roller coasters, this is way better. And then with materials and understanding how they work, the siding that we were using, you know, it behaved differently than we thought it would, and we learned by playing with these materials and really working with them to know what we were doing. So play with samples, get pieces of chunks of things and fiddle around with them and see what they do, see what they fail at, and pick new ones. And then probably the most exciting part of this is being out there and getting to share our story with 20,000 people over 10 days. This thing that we had lived, eat, breathed, slept, everything. And then getting to share that story and continuing to share it with people like you. It's awesome. This is, or up on the upper right is the line the day after we'd won. And it was around the block, and it was great because you had this huge captive audience that wanted to hear what you were saying about sustainable design. And as a student, there's absolutely nothing more empowering than seeing people your parents and your grandparents' age and the people who are going to employ you taking an interest in what you're saying and really appreciating that you've had a valuable experience and that you have something to offer, because you do, and really, you know, getting excited about that. Again, another view of people as they're walking in and becoming a part of that experience. And, you know, to Leah's point that most suburban houses really, like, they have no relationship to people. But the buildings wouldn't be there if it weren't for the people like us that need them to live in. So having this kind of an opportunity to showcase design, but to also be able to showcase that relationship between people and the buildings that they're a part of and how they get to interact with them and the stories behind them is really exciting to do. So anybody who's going to graduate school, see if the school you're applying to does the solar decathlon.
So we talked about the process that we went through for the competitions. Now let's talk about the house. But before the house, why? So we all know by now that buildings use tons of our energy. As we learned from Michelle, almost half of our energy comes from buildings. And it's a big, you know, crisis globally, and we're learning how to address it, and we've come up with tons of technologies to address it. But Maryland this year really wanted to say, you know, the solar decathlon has been done now, 5 times, and we've started to learn how to address energy in our homes. Let's look at another thing as well, and that is another precious resource that we use irresponsibly in our homes, which is water. Domestic residential water is the 3rd greatest water use in the US, and on, I think, statistics, we account for 30 billion gallons of water a day in the US, which is absurd. And 1 in 6 people in the world is living without access to even potable water, and yet Americans, on average, we consume over 100 gallons of water a day through showers and dishwashers and irrigation of our own backyards.
And then you have to drink it too.
Yeah, and then as Michelle pointed out, it's being used in our toilets, which, as she said, is totally unacceptable. So we said, you know, why not address both? Why not look at both energy and water? And the other, that's sort of at a global scale, but at a local scale, we're designing for our own regional climate. We're designing for Maryland, for the DC region, and we're right next to the Chesapeake Bay. So we drew inspiration from the Chesapeake Bay, knowing that it was this sort of large-scale ecosystem. It's the largest estuary in the US that has this sort of subtle ecological balance between 3,600 plant, animal, and fish species, and yet they all work together to create this home. So we sort of took that as inspiration and said, well, if the ecosystem can work at this scale, why can't we design it at the scale of a house and create sort of this micro-scale ecosystem where the house is not only producing its own energy, but also, you know, converting its own waste into nutrients back into the land, where we're not sending our water back into municipal water supplies, but rather we're treating it on-site and managing our own stormwater runoff.
Sorry.
No.
And so it's dissimilar from the pictures that Leah started with. Our house was founded on that idea of being embedded in the landscape, that, you know, it wasn't just going to sit there. It was going to be engaged and be an active participant in its landscape, and vice versa, that, you know, the landscape would be a better part for having the house, and the house would be way better for having the landscape and that dynamic relationship between them.
So we started with 4 primary design principles, which we've kind of already addressed. Obviously solar energy and technology, but also using both active and passive design strategies. So using overhangs to block solar heat gain in the summer and yet let the heat gain in the winter when the sun angle's lower. By mixing these two, you become a lot more efficient in your design. So architecture and engineering start to sort of collaborate and work together. And then also noticing that technology, solar panels and things are not the only way to harness the sun's energy, but also plant media is another way to harness, you know, photosynthesis and growing things. So trying to develop a form that started to relate to these concepts was definitely a challenge, and it was a long design process. But it was also exciting because we were able to sort of say, now we have those 4 design principles, but we also need to make this thing a house. So the program of a house. We started with basically the rectangle you see in the top left. Imagine that's our site. That's the limit that we can build on. Then you take your program and you say, you know that the house has private and public functions. And then from there, you know you want to create outdoor spaces that, you know, you can start to visually and physically connect with the outdoor environment. So you slide these 2 programs apart. And then more importantly, and I'm sorry, but the color didn't show up in this, but the central axis that you start to create where you're collecting water in the center of the home as opposed to shutting it off. And water becomes the focal central point of the design. So that slowly turned into an actual architectural design that was scaled to a house where you had living room and kitchen in your sort of public realm, and then bedroom and office in your sort of more private realm. And the bathroom was actually the joint between these 2 pieces of program. So 3-dimensionally, Ali talked a little bit about how we had to take this apart. So initially, we weren't sure how we were going to transport this, which meant that the roofs might have to come off due to the height. So we actually designed it that the roofs, there's a seam, that the roofs can actually just be lifted off of the house, which is sort of the diagram you're seeing here. But again, you see the dynamic relationships between the outdoor deck spaces and the indoor living spaces, and the 2 roof forms that are actually inverting the typical gable roof like this and turning it into a way that we're celebrating collecting the water as opposed to just shutting it off the site. And the roofs also played another really important part. I mean, obviously one was about collecting water, and it actually had a green roof on it, so it helped slow down rainwater as it was raining. It helped manage the sort of flash flood effect of it just piling up in the center. It slowed it down and absorbed some of it. But the other roof housed our solar panels, which actually sort of need to have a specific degree to maximize their efficiency. So technology and the water collection all started to play a role in the form and the architecture of our house. And we got this really beautiful juxtaposition between nature and technology on our roofs. A lot of the houses, a lot of people believe that, you know, sustainable design is about taking these technologies and just slapping them on your house. Well, oh, I get some solar panels, I put them on the roof, I have a sustainable home. But we really wanted to teach people that it was the integration between the design and the technologies and the landscape, and how all of them work together simultaneously and were informed by one another. And that was what Watershed was more about.
I'm getting a little bit more technical about it and how, in the process, that comes together. So the images on the left are examples of the energy modeling that our engineering team was working through as well. And I had never seen these before. At that point, I had gone through 5 years of architecture school, and I had never seen a diagram like that before in my life, which was kind of a travesty, actually. But you start to understand, what the requirements of your building are from a design perspective to get those kinds of mechanical technologies to work. So, air conditioning doesn't just de facto happen. It happens because you've designed a good building and that the systems work efficiently within that building. And to help do that, through those diagrams, our engineering team gave us a challenge, and they said, look, we need you to create a building envelope, everything from the outside to the inside, that has a thermal resistance of R40. Okay, how are we gonna do that? We don't know, but we're gonna figure it out. And you need to have a roof system and a floor system that have about an R50. Okay,
A typical home is about R20.
yeah.
That's
so,
the insulating value of
and
the
we had
walls.
made our problem more challenging for ourselves. This house had a lot of perimeter to it, and the more perimeter you have, the more leak you have between the inside and the out. So we had to develop this system. So in the diagram on the left, that's kind of a chunk of our wall and what its composition was. So the green roof on the top and the drywall on the bottom of that roof sandwich, those are everything that you can see, right? And those are what, you know, most people, most regular homeowners care about, because that's what they can see, that's what they can touch. But it's everything in between that saves you money. And that's what you spend your time designing when you're going through something like this. And the same thing happens in the wall, that, you know, that exterior finish cladding and the drywall on the inside, that's what you see, but it's everything in between that really makes a huge difference on how the building performs. And we had gone through the process of having drawn all of these details about how the building went together and what the different layers were. But it wasn't until we were installing those layers and really understanding how they played with one another that, you know, all of a sudden those lines that we were drawing, they meant something, because, you know, that line meant that black layer that you had just spent Saturday painting on. And to work with that thermal efficiency, it also meant trying to understand our structural system. And part of this was driven by where we had placed openings in the building, and part of it was also driven by our attempts to achieve that R40 envelope. So in the structure, typically in a home you would have, you know, 2x4, 2x6 studs, wood studs every 16 or 24 inches on center, right? And every time there's a stud like that, there are two sides. And every one of those sides is an opportunity for air to leak around. So we said, all right, and we were working with our structural engineer, we said, how can we make this problem less? What do we do? How can we have more continuous insulation? And he said, all right, well, what if we start to think about it as these frames, right? So we had these triple 2x6 stud blocks that went together. And as a result, we had fewer edges, fewer seams. And fewer seams meant we had more continuous insulation, which meant our envelope performed better than it could have. So we had this 13-inch wall from outside to inside that incorporated a ton of insulation, and that also had an efficient structural system so that the envelope would work nicely and allow the mechanical systems that our engineering students were designing to be as efficient as possible. Oh, my gosh. So what did it look like, right? You know, we've kind of showed you everything except the really beautiful shots of what was it like to be walking around in this. So this is standing in our kitchen looking back toward the living room. People enter through the doorway on the right, the glass opening. And this was the public bar where people were supposed to be able to hold their parties, to socialize. We actually threw a couple parties in here for donors and people that had helped us along the process. And it was a great space to gather in and be part of. The ceilings were tall, and that let in north light, which was kind of diffuse and evenly lit the spaces. It meant that we didn't have to turn the lights on a lot, which was great. And, you know, in the materials as well, one of the things that the Eames were talking about was using off-the-shelf pieces. And our kind of bent towards the affordability contest was, how do you make an extraordinary home with ordinary materials? And so we had, you know, there's nothing overly fancy about this. It's a whole bunch of 2x6s, it's drywall, it's cabinets, which are basically wood, and concrete countertop. But because of the way we combine them, you get this really aesthetic environment that sponsors a kind of life that everybody who was working on this project subscribed to. From the opposite end, so this idea of this large volume that, you know, there are multiple spaces in here, but there's flexibility so that you could use this whole volume as one place, or understand it as being more than one as well. Connections to this one also talks about connection to the outdoors through those glass doors, and then the other bar through those glass doors at the end, that these spaces kind of elongated themselves into the landscape that was beyond them. It's kind of curious in our house, and everyone who walked through asked, we didn't have a bed that you could see. And people were like, where's the bedroom? Where do you sleep in this house? And Leah will talk a little bit more about furniture in a second, but that table that you see in this image is the bed. And we worked with some manufacturers to produce pieces. But with our program, the competition allows you to kind of define who you're trying to sell your house to. And we were interested in people who live between Baltimore and Washington, D.C., who could commute from home. We have some of the worst traffic on the planet around here. It's awful. No one should drive, ever. And we were saying, well, if you could get some of those people off the road and get them telecommuting and get them working from home, that would be great. But not all work could happen at that little office desk on the right-hand side. Sometimes you really need like a conference table. You know, how many of you have spaces in your architecture buildings that you walk out and you throw something huge on a table, or you make a model on something larger than your desk? So we needed this conference space that we developed. And Leah will talk more.
So now I wish I'd put the bed first,
Sorry.
but the table. Yeah, as Allie mentioned, we also designed the furniture, and which was one of the most exciting parts about the whole house as a student, really. It was another way of saying, let's take a typical dining room table. It's large. Where the heck is it going to go in our house? Our house is 900 square feet interior space. You know, those are restrictions of the competition. And, you know, so we had this amazing opportunity to sort of reinvent what we knew. So these tables, actually, we worked with Herman Miller, who actually manufactured the furniture we designed for us. And those tables you see actually sit on top of the birch carts that you see in the corners. They just sit right on top of it, and whenever you need it, you just slide it right off and take it down. They also expand in the middle, so they're narrower when they're up, and they're at countertop height space when they're against the wall, and then you pull them down and they're at tabletop space because they're not lifted anymore. And the bed, actually, we nicknamed it the taco bed. It folds up in itself. So the mattress stays inside the bed, and you actually just fold it up, and it turns into a conference table. So the top of the desk become the legs of the bed. And I mean, Allie, you can agree, this was really exciting to watch happen and work through, because it was just so different than anything we knew. And there's actually a really quick, short 20-second video that shows some of our, oh, maybe there is. That shows some of our flexible. We also designed this media unit with off-the-shelf parts, but we sort of arranged it in a way that was flexible and modular for the house.
There's a lot more of this on YouTube, talking about alternative media. There's about 15 different minutes of video stuff that you can find.
So we've talked about the sort of two big shed modules, but really the focal point of the design was the bathroom, which is the connection between the two. On both sides of the bathroom were floor-to-ceiling glass, which seems a little strange, and we had some people walk through the house that loved it, some people,
Hated it.
mainly on the older side, looked at us like we were crazy.
There were blinds.
There were blinds, but the idea was that this wetland, which I haven't got to yet, and I'll get to in just a second, which are constructed wetlands, which is where all the water was being captured in the center of our house, was visible in the bathroom at all times. And these wetlands actually filtered the gray water from our home. So in case you're not familiar, gray water is all the non-solid waste water, so dishwasher and sink and shower water. And that stuff doesn't need to be going to get processed expensively using a ton of energy. It can actually just be processed and filtered by natural plant media, which is what we did. So when you're taking a shower, you're actually watching the water drain below you and go out into the wetlands right next to you. And so the education factor wasn't just about public outreach, but it was also about the idea that the home can educate its dweller, and the home can serve to sort of inspire and educate whoever's living inside of it. Sort of a different way of looking at sustainable design. But what you see here is sort of a cross-section through the house, and the wetlands on the left were rainwater collection, almost an open-faced cistern. So that water was just drained off the PV roof, and we collected it, and then we could reuse it on all our landscaping and irrigation. And the other side, the stepped one that you see, is the gray water filtration. So all that gray water from inside of the house is going and being filtered into that, and then once again used back on landscape irrigation and taking the demand off a lot of our water in the house. But we believe that a truly sustainable home does not just conserve its resources, but it also produces its own resources. Mm-hmm. So we had an edible deck and garden, which once again could get irrigated with this processed rainwater and gray water. And we grew a ton of vegetables and plants, and those green walls, the vines grew grapes and fruits.
And we ate this stuff. It was great.
We did. We had a dinner party, actually, at the house.
And then to kind of close out our design stuff, we were working a lot with all of the engineers, and we've talked about this. So probably the most exciting part, right, is that, you know, how many of you go to architecture school or go to the architecture office every day, and you talk to hundreds of other architects all day long, and maybe you talk to an engineer on the phone once in a while or every day if you're in that part of the project. But what was really exciting for us as students was that, you know, we had this opportunity to meet people that we would never have met if it weren't for this project. So the guy on the right, Jeff, is one of our engineering students, and he was working with us on this technology called the liquid desiccant waterfall. So the basic concept is like the packets that come in your shoes that take out moisture. Maryland's a really hot, humid place, and the energy-intensive part of air conditioning is actually removing the water from the air, not changing the temperature of it. So we tried to separate those two processes, the water removal part and the temperature part of it. And what the LDW did was to take in that hot, humid air using a solution. That solution would pull the humidity out of the air and eject drier air, not cooler, but just drier, and then the air conditioning systems in the house could then function much more efficiently because they weren't trying to deal with both water in the air and temperature, but just temperature. Part of it was also about putting engineering on display. Leah talked a little bit about how the bathroom was intended to teach people about life. And this is our solar thermal wall, which used heat energy from the sun to heat a solution that transferred heat into water, so that all of our domestic hot water was able to use the sun's thermal energy to get hot instead of using electricity, which is a way more efficient process. But part of what was also interesting was that this became an architectural element. So this deck had a southeast exposure, which meant it was going to be really hot and nasty to be in Maryland in the summer. But when we have this solar thermal wall, which needs the solar access, and we put that in plane to block the sun, all of a sudden that deck becomes the world's best place to be on a summer afternoon because it's shaded, it's protected, you're using the sun where you want it on these solar thermal arrays, and really finding a way to find that happy marriage between architecture and engineering, that the engineering can help make better architecture and the architecture helps make better engineering. So what now? We designed this great house, it went to a competition, it won, and then we still have this house, so what happens? And we were really fortunate that one of our sponsors, Pepco, purchased the house and is in the process of setting it back up, and it'll be publicly visitable for tours. The image in the upper right hand was kind of a conceptual site diagram that we had developed. And there's actually going to be a third shed, or another module of the house that we will be creating so that Pepco has kind of a lab space, if you will, to go with this house to run tests and that sort of thing. So that idea of the shed module really kind of took off with this particular design and helped us find a way to expand it for its next life. So that was us.
Go build a house.
Go build a house.
Hi, everybody. I'm Jason. I'm the filmmaker one of the filmmakers who made the Eames film. I'm not an architect. I don't really know anything about architecture. Architects to me are like astrophysicists or something like that. And when they talk, it's just like, whoa, I have no idea what you're talking about. But I'm always really impressed. I'm always really impressed. I try to follow along. So first of all, I just want to thank the NEH for making this event happen, Chairman Leach, Courtney and Claire and Caitlin, the C's as we've been calling them, and Jose Centeno. This is really great. It's really thrilling for me to show the Eames film to architects and especially to architecture students. There's not an audience that I think appreciates it more or understands the ideas behind it more, and architecture students are the only ones who laugh at the part when Janine Opalwal says, you know, I was happy to be exploited by a proper master. Nobody else laughs at that part, but architecture students seem to think that's really funny. So I also need to thank the NEH, of course, for making the film possible, because when we were telling people, you know, we were starting to raise money for the film, and we would tell people that we're making a film about Charles and Ray Eames, they go, oh, okay, so you're going to make a film about those brothers who made that chair. That's going to be really interesting. You know, there was not in the general, people out there just didn't really see that there was going to be a really big audience for it, but there has been, and the NEH was, really the people who were able to see that, and they gave us the funding, most of the funding for it, and they gave us early funding for it. So I just need to say thank you for that. So I'm going to moderate a short panel discussion with Michelle and Leah and Allison. Before I do that, I just want to say a couple things about Charles and Ray just for a couple minutes. Oh, can we get that the squigglies up there? Is that possible to get those out? I'm the filmmaker, but I'm the only one who didn't. What do I do? I don't see anything that says next slide. Oh, this one? I'm the filmmaker. I'm the only one who didn't bring my own.
There you go.
My own imagery. Thank you. Michelle brought this, and I decided that I would use it. So everybody wanted to know what the squigglies were. So this is actually a really famous drawing done by Charles. It's his Venn diagram. And I think it relates to a lot of what Michelle and Lee and Allison have been talking about, and also what I hope that we talk about when we have our little discussion. But basically what this is it shows the various overlapping interests in architecture or in design. So you have one squiggly area which represents the designer or the architect's interest. What do they want to do? What are they interested in? Then there's a squiggly which represents the client's interest. What does the client want? And then there's another squiggly which represents what's good for society in general. What does the world need? What do we need? And what Charles always said was that he really only worked with a lot of passion when he was working in that area of mutual triple overlap, that darkly shaded area in the middle. And I think that relates to a lot of what Michelle and Leigh and Allison are doing. I think it's really important. So let me just say something about Charles and Ray. People always like to use this term, oh, Charles and Ray, timeless design is, timeless. It's a silly term. Charles and Ray, their design was not timeless. It was definitely, they came from a time. And all design, all architecture comes from a specific time. Charles was born in St. Louis in 1907. He always described himself as a child of the industrial age. He was interested in trains, in airplanes, in cities, and the problems of people in cities. Ray was just a few years younger than him, from Sacramento, but I think that they shared an experience which was the Great Depression, which made a huge impact on the way that they thought about things. The Depression was obviously, it was well named. It was not a time of high spirits, but there were a lot of people during the Depression who were found at a time almost of optimism, because they were able to spend their time contemplating what the world could look like when we emerged from that economic malaise of the 1930s. One of the places where this was happening, maybe as much as anywhere else, was Cranbrook outside of Detroit, where Charles and Ray met, like you saw in the film. People at Cranbrook, they were architects, they were designers, they were craftspeople. And what they were thinking about is, how can we envision a new society? How can we recast the world basically from scratch when this is all over? And what they came up with was this idea that we now call modernism. Modernism existed before that, but they put their stamp on it in a way that was very important. Modernism meant that you could unite art and industry together to create high-quality goods, products, things like homes and furniture, for not just for an elite few, but for large numbers of people who had never been able to afford these things before. So it was basically a utopian vision at the time. And think about it in the midst of, the 1930s, when there were no jobs, there was no money, but these people were thinking grand thoughts. They were devising grand schemes. And Charles and Ray, of course, were not the only ones. A lot of their mid-century colleagues were working on these problems. But what they basically believed was that design and architecture, as Michelle said, could save the world, at the very least by adhering to a set of ethical principles that they could be a powerful force for progress, for good in the world. I said that Charles and Ray's design is not timeless, but it has been very durable. I mean, it still sells like crazy. You know, Herman Miller furniture designed by Charles and Ray Eames is still very, very popular. And so many people kind of copy Charles and Ray designs. So people always want to know, what is it about their designs that is so, you know, quote unquote timeless? Why is it so enduring? And my opinion has always been that they did more than just create designs. They also created the set of criteria that we now use to sort of judge what's good design. What does it look like? They took a lot of the precepts that had come from the Bauhaus and elsewhere in Europe, and they added, you know, color, fun, whimsy, lots of choice. You know, they believed in giving people not just, you know, one color furniture, but 50 colors of furniture with 30 different bases. And they added a lot of sort of technological sophistication. So they kind of put an American stamp on it. And it basically became a template for what good design is today. And I don't think that a whole lot has changed since then. I think we still use most of the same criteria, except there's one really, really important thing, which is ecological sustainability. So when Charles and Ray were most active in, you know, what we call the Eames era, this was the age of affluence in America. It was a time when personal consumption reached unheard of heights. Resources were seen as virtually limitless. And it was really only late in their career in the early 1970s, say, when people, designers and architects, really started to take into account ecological sustainability. So that's what, you know, Michelle and Leah and Allison, it's foremost in their minds, but I don't, you know, maybe I'm wrong, but I don't think a lot of architects in the 50s and 60s were really that concerned about it. I think that Charles and Ray, you know, I think that they actually were kind of ahead of their times in terms of thinking about environmental issues. I'll throw out a couple of examples. They wanted to build right here in Washington, D.C., they were part of a team that was going to design what is it called? An aquarium, a national aquarium here in D.C., and it was going to highlight marine conservation. It ended up getting defunded. It didn't happen, which is really a shame. They also, in 1956, they were thinking about responsible sourcing for the rosewood in their famous leather lounge and ottoman chair. I don't think in 1956 there were a lot of furniture designers who were thinking about, you know, if they were going to responsibly source their wood. Another thing that was referred to is the solar do-nothing machine. This was something that they designed in 1957 when Alcoa, the metal company, came to them and said, hey, we have this exciting new material called aluminum, and we want you to design anything. You can design anything in the world that you want. So, you know, and we're going to, you know, put it in magazines and stuff like that. And Charles and Ray decided to make a toy that they called the solar do-nothing machine. It was this colorful sort of pinwheel whirligig machine that was solar paneled, solar powered. And at the time what they said was, well, people don't really use this very much now, but we have a feeling that, you know, sometime in the future this solar power is going to be integrated into a lot of things that we do. That was in 1957. You know, what Charles said was that he didn't believe in compromise. He was never going to compromise, but he would always embrace constraints. And there's just no doubt in my mind that if Charles and Ray were working today, they would be wholeheartedly embracing the constraint of environmental or ecological sustainability that Michelle and Leah and Allison have embraced in their work. So what I'm driving at here is that Charles and Ray, I think, were very innovative in their time, and I'm more than happy to talk about what they accomplished, but I think when we have our talk, I hope that we can focus more on the future and what the future holds. How has that constraint of sustainability changed the way architects and designers work today, and how will that change going forward? So I'm going to bring everybody up. So, is this working? Can you hear me?
Is this working?
Should I just scream? Is that on? Okay, good. So, sort of following from what I was just saying, I want to ask my first question to Michelle. So if the Eames era was the era of the age of affluence, then what are we living in today? Is it the age of limits, or is it the age of possibilities?
I would definitely go with age of possibilities. We have so much right at our fingertips. We have so much information. We have these super powerful systems. We have computing power. We have direct access to almost anyone in the world, and I think we don't yet know how to maximize all of that. I think it's like we're still in the adolescent stage of figuring out what it means, and I think it's just a super exciting time for architects. I think we have some of the best tools based on how our minds work and how we think about things, that anything is possible for us. And I honestly, I really do think that you're the generation of superheroes for figuring out how to really maximize all that we have.
Leigh and Allison, do you feel you're, from this generation that, you could easily just feel saddled with, the problems and the mistakes of previous generations? We're sort of running, this feeling that we're running out of resources. Do you see it as an opportunity, or do you see it as, that it's just a burden that you, that you have to live with?
I think it's really easy to get overwhelmed at times, especially when Michelle brought up that 7 billion number. That's something that overwhelms me quite frequently. But I think that it's definitely opportunity, and it excites me more than it scares me. So hopefully it's the same for all of you. But yeah, I think that we do have a lot of challenges ahead of us and a lot of things that we're going to have to sort of conquer, but it's sort of nothing design can't handle. So if there's anything.
How do you feel that the tools that you have coming out of architecture school prepares you to take on those challenges?
I think later in the film as well, there was a comment that what the Eames were really selling was their own ignorance in a subject and their ability to go learn and how to solve it. And I think coming out of school, that's probably the biggest asset you have, is that you have absolutely no preconceptions about how the built environment should happen. You have nothing to go off of. And I remember, it was probably like I had just started my job. I'd probably been there 3 or 4 months. And I walked into a meeting and I said, why don't we do more of this? Why don't we do more sustainable buildings? Why aren't clients interested in this? Why don't we do more of it? Because pretty fundamentally, it never dawned on me that you could build something other than the way that we built Watershed, because we'd never done it. And I think coming out of school, that's what your biggest asset is that, that questioning and that probing, and it's finding the right people wherever you work, in whatever discipline, in whatever field you end up with, that are willing to answer your questions, and they're willing to take the time to help show you why things are the way that they are, and then you, with your unformed ideas, to then be able to create new ones from that.
If I can just add to that too, because I think it's a really good question. I think another thing to do is, not unlike the Eames, be super open to collaborating with people who are very unlikely characters. And so, they worked with a lot of unlikely characters. They, were working with IBM. And so I think in a similar way, when we start to merge different ways of thinking, it's when we have really exciting results. So, for example, look at the transportation industry. Big carbon emitter, not as big as buildings, but big. Kills a lot of people, really reduces our quality of living. And so Google looked at, okay, is there something we can do using artificial intelligence to look at this problem? Not a really likely way to look at it. Thus, they came up with a self-driving car, which makes a lot of sense. So it reduces carbon emissions, greatly reduces people who are going to be killed, and increases our quality of living. And so, in a similar way, are there things that we can be looking at with artificial intelligence that can actually help how we think about designing buildings, how we can think about innovation, that I think is pretty great.
Well, I wanted to ask you you mentioned, you showed a picture of a Prius and in your presentation, and I think that people do have an impression, a feeling that our problem is really about the cars that we drive. And if everybody just bought a Prius, that we would, the environmental catastrophe would be averted. So how do you change the subject? How do you get people to realize that buildings are more of the problem than transportation?
I think there's kind of three parts to that. And while I think it's been, great that what the Prius-ish, recycling has done is it's sort of brought to everyone's attention that there are things we can do, but now we need to dramatically switch the conversation to like, okay, that really doesn't actually matter, like all those little things, like it needs to be big. But I think there's, one is awareness, which is why it's so great, the solar decathlon and having really beautiful, inspiring examples of that people, are excited about and it can resonate with them. So that's sort of one part is awareness. The second part is the government and building codes and legislation, and it needs to be much easier to incorporate things like gray water, for example. It's just maddening, and there's lots of people who support it, but it just takes too long to get there. And then the third part is to then have really great options and really great solutions, because even if the building codes change and even if there is awareness, there has to be really great solutions. And so it's those three parts, and I think that architects can actually be really great at helping each of those three parts. And it's kind of our responsibility too, to actually think about all three.
So I think we're gonna want to throw the questions out to the audience in a second, but let me ask one more. So there's somebody in the audience named Ford Petrus who is with the Library of Congress, and he's one of the people that we interviewed in the film. And when I asked him, what he thought Charles and Ray's biggest contribution or most long-lasting contribution to design was, he said it wasn't any one particular design, it was the process that Charles and Ray used in terms of how they approached their problems. And, so that I didn't really understand what that meant when he first said it to me, but then when I talked to a lot of other people, I realized that what the Eames office really was a research office. There was a huge amount of effort that went into really deeply understanding what a problem was before they would attempt to try to solve it. So I was very impressed with the Watershed project. It seemed like it was really a research project as much as, so I was hoping you could tell us a little bit about that. How did you approach figuring out what the need was or what the problem was, and then what were the steps that you took from there?
Allie can probably speak to this even more than me because she started a little bit earlier, but it's a really good question because it was really hard trying to fit our process into a couple slides. You guys saw how we came up with the sort of partie diagram of the house, but that was millions of pieces of sketch paper later. So it was a big process, and it started with, I won't hear you talk about that part.
So when we started, there were 3 courses, a course of architects, a course of engineers, and a course of environmental science students. And it was us all standing around like that one picture, tossing ideas around on the table, and the engineers kicking them back and forth. And then there really was that kind of aha moment, and there's this really ugly sketch that one of our faculty members has, and I really want it because I want to frame it. But the team of us were sitting around, we had to put this thing together at the last minute, but you'd spent so much time thinking through this problem. And we were all talking and drawing at the same time and drawing what we're talking about and at the same time, and then all of a sudden there's this really ugly thing that you wouldn't, hang with pride, but at the same time it's the best thinking drawing we probably made in the entire process because it represents all of the ideas we were interested in. And then the other part of the process that's particularly challenging for the Solar Decathlon is that you define your own problem and then you have to go solve it. And about 8 months after you define what that problem is, you say, man, I made some terrible choices. And I mean that because, you're designing a house, but everybody lives in a house of some kind or another. And you have to define who that person is that you're trying to sell this house to, who that target market is that you're trying to appeal to. And all back and forth through the design process, we kept going back and forth going, who are we serving? And would you really want this? Like, would this mythical people that you've created, would they want this? And then separate from these people that you're trying to serve, will the public actually like this? And it becomes this kind of challenge back and forth. So I think a lot of it is conversation in that process. A lot of it is testing things out and not being afraid of that, and knowing that, you know, those failures really are lessons in and of themselves, that it's more of an experiment, and that some of those things will go back and forth.
The biggest learning experience that I can share with you guys also is draw every idea you have, because even though it may seem like a terrible idea at the beginning, process is always about getting those bad ideas out first and then maybe coming back to a terrible sketch and saying, you know what, there actually might be something here if we start to combine this with that.
And somebody else can pick up on a bad idea and turn it into a good idea, right?
Yeah, and that sometimes gets lost in all the political building codes, and you get weighed down. I'm gonna apologize to my boss who's in the audience, but you know, you don't always get those opportunities to just get everything out on paper and share it with everyone. Like she was saying, sharing is the biggest and most crucial part of design collaboration.
So I think we want to get questions from the audience if possible, and I actually have a question that I wanted to ask just the general audience. So if anybody wants to, instead of asking them a question, if anybody wants to get up and respond to my question, you can do that instead. Here's my question. Charles Eames was very skeptical of architecture school. He dropped out of the program at Washington University in St. Louis. And he often told his young designers that universities should be called institutes of higher teaching instead of institutes of higher learning. So I'm wondering how you all feel that architecture school is preparing you for the real world, and are there things that you wish that you could be doing that you're not? And but so you can either answer that question or you can ask a question of folks here, and I think we have a couple. Yeah. Yes, sir.
I've always seen academia as more of an incubator for students, more along the lines of allowing them to figure out what they want to do in life and allowing them to develop the skill sets and mentality for wanting to accomplish that, whatever it may be. Because a lot of times you go into school and you have a preconceived notion as to what you want to do, and then you get to that first class and you're like, this sucks. So then you go from there, and it's sort of evolving yourself as a person. And if you kind of want to figure out at the end, if you want to be that architect and what kind of architect you want to become, then you can go forth into school and be like, these are the projects I want to do. These are the professors I want to learn from. And that's how I've always seen academia, as less of a static thing and more of a dynamic one. So that's my answer.
Does that sound right to y'all?
Yeah, and I would also say that that process never stops. That I've learned just as much in the last 18 months of actually working as I did in school, that I still think I'm a student, and I hope I never stop being a student. I think, you know, there's so much we can learn. Architects impact everything, like Michelle was saying. You know, architecture and design can solve a lot of problems if you're willing to let it. And part of that is learning what those problems are and how to solve them. So you just keep doing it and keep learning. It's fun.
It would be rare if you knew exactly what you wanted to do going in or out of school. Yeah, it's when, you know, Michelle crossed out the word architect and had all those other descriptions. That's really what it's going to be like. You know, we're changing our role all the time, so be open to anything.
Does anyone else have any questions you want to?
I have a question for you guys as well. I'm actually a grad student in Maryland, so I see
I thought you looked familiar.
Well, thank you. I saw that in Michelle's work, you've scaled your projects from single family up on through. And a lot of times what we learn in scale has, you know, for Watershed, it's a single family home. How do you scale the technology and the methodologies that you've learned there into your more conventional practices, you could say?
That was my thesis. Can I steal or you go? Okay. So that's a really great jumping off point. We had designed this single family home, right? And I was going through thesis at Maryland. That was the point of my education that I was in. And I loved Watershed. I loved what I was doing. And I was at a dinner with a couple faculty friends, and we were sitting down going, what is Allie going to do for her thesis? That was the question. And we started tossing that around. And at the end of this, you know, really great food, we had decided, okay, what I could study and what I could do would be to figure out how do we take all these principles that we designed for a single-family home and address all 64,000 square miles of the Chesapeake Bay watershed, which was incredibly daunting. And I ended up designing 4 buildings, each of which embraced those same principles, but dealt with them differently. So starting to take that idea of scaling, because obviously the design that we created was never intended to be a multifamily dwelling or like a a high rise, but at the same time, any building could have a green roof if it wanted to. Any building could have a constructed wetland cistern system. Any building could accommodate solar panels, those kinds of things. So, the same way that we all do precedent studies in school and distill the principles from that to make our own design work better, watershed became a precedent for all these other things that find the principle and then reapply it back to something of a larger scale.
And I'm going to go back to working with unlikely characters. I was fortunate enough to spend a day with Yvon Chouinard. Do you guys know this guy? Who's the Patagonia guy. And if you don't know him, you should check him out and read his book. So he created this company that we all know and love, and it's a really thoughtful company. People love to work there. And I was talking to him about some things that he's doing, and he's working with Walmart. And this was a couple of years ago, and I was like, Walmart, what on earth are you doing with Walmart? And his point was that if he can help Walmart move to organic foods, that changes the way the world produces food, period. And so I think that there's a lot that we can do, like the solar decathlon, like the work that many of us have been doing, to work from the bottom up to do proof of concept, which can be great. But then to work with people who actually, are at the top and work from the top down and then have the two weave together. I think that's where we can actually, and it sort of requires scale at this point, to bring those good ideas and where we can actually make a lot of change.
So, here we go.
Please ask more, we don't bite.
Being one of the senior members of the audience, we're here in Washington, and Washington's about politics. And several of you have talked about the fact that building codes are an issue. What I'm interested in is, what role do you see for you and the other people here in politics in changing, because we hear so often that new regulations stifle. And that's exactly what you want to do. You want to set up new regulations. And so what do you see your role as politicians, as activists, to do this and get the point across and not just be architects who sit and have fun? And I have to say that I was General Counsel of the National Endowment for the Arts, and Charles Eames was on the council, and he was a great fun guy.
Yeah, I think that's a really good question, and I think it is our role to not just take the conventional idea of, we just design buildings and that's our part, and we just receive whatever codes are given to us, but become a part of that process. And there are lots of great organizations that one can easily connect with, either in your local community, or there's groups like, the Architecture 2030 Challenge, or like Living Building Challenge, who all have local and state groups that you can become a part of, and also help provide awareness. And sometimes it does take a lot of legwork too. And we've done this a bunch of times, where we go to do a house in a place where gray water, for example, is not currently allowed, and then spending the time doing the education, doing a brown bag lunch for the people that are in the building department to talk about gray water, to then help actually change that. And we've done that a number of times, and I think that that's exciting. It's our responsibility. I don't know if you guys have thoughts there.
I agree, but I think it also just, again, goes back to the same concept I'm going to go to 1,000 times, and that's outreach and education, like getting people to understand why these policies should be changed or why we need to move in a certain direction. Because if people, the masses are not understanding or are not aware of some of the challenges that we face in the design world, then it's going to be harder to get them changed.
add to that too, and sharing. It's kind of great that you can actually use, like, lots of cities are being competitive with one another, like who's the most green city, which is great, and we can use that to our advantage. The downside of that competition is then sometimes they actually don't share their best policies or how they got there or the methods, but we can, like, that is it's public information, and so that is something that we can also help do. So if we are finding that if we're working in one county that there are some really great things that they're doing, we can use that competition if we're working in the next county to then share that with them and be like, okay, look, this is what these guys are doing, and they're getting a lot of credit for it, and they're getting a lot of praise for that. Where's your deal? And so that's great too.
So this is something I've always wanted to say. We're all about to get thrown out of the White House, but we we have time for one more question.
All right, first off, I want to give a shout out to another fellow Cyclone. So happy
What are the Cyclones? Is this a roller derby club or something?
There's this place called Iowa.
Oh, okay. Okay. Oh yeah, I fly over that all the time. I'm sorry, Chairman.
Michelle, you talked about obviously sustainable buildings and sustainable lifestyles, and you touched on sustainable life meaning taking care of ourselves and not being that kid who's falling asleep on his desk like you showed. And I'm sure there are plenty of people here who'd love to hear all of you guys, especially students who just made that transition. How does it go? I mean, you're still alive, so somehow you manage, but if we're transitioning to this more sustainable lifestyle, how do you see that being a personal thing as growing out to your family, to your community, to your world?
And I would ask that of Jason too, what he sees from his work in looking at the Eames and how they were able to do all that they did, but still have their lives.
I'll answer that very briefly and then pass to you. My wife and I are, we have a production company together, so we're sort of like Charles and Ray in that way, and only in that way. And, we actually put limits on stuff. When it's time to pick up the kids, it's over. We put away the work for a while, and I think it's important to do that. But I'll let you guys answer her question because it's really about architecture.
Work hard, play hard? It's a tough question because in school we all fall asleep on our desks and we all feel like architecture pushes us to the brink and we have to continually design. But in all honesty, in some respects, you learn more from getting out and doing things than you do sitting at your desk. So make sure that you take that time to go out and have experiences because I promise they'll be applicable to the classroom as well. I'm being short so we don't get kicked out.
I don't.
Michelle, you like to talk about play, the importance of play in your work, and that was very important to Charles and Ray, so how does that fit in?
Yeah, well, I'm still trying to find the sustainability in my own life, which is a constant piece of work in itself, and sort of designing that piece of work. But something that I think with this idea of sharing, let's just step back for a minute. Like, it is kind of crazy how much time all of us spend doing things that have been done 1,000 times before. Why do we all have to design our own toilet details and structural details that are so similar? So this idea of sharing that information so no one has to do it again. So that way we can actually be spending our time at our highest and best use, which is coming up with new, cool, exterior wall systems that not only collect water but grow food and help insulation that can renew itself. And so that's something that I'm really interested in right now, is finding ways to share and sort of reduce the mundane so that way we can maximize the innovation.
Great. Well, thank you so much, everybody.